Very long time ago, in a faraway land, nestled deep within the mountains, there was a village called Selia. The village lay in a lush valley surrounded by towering peaks, untouched by the outside world. The people of Selia lived in peace, their hearts bound to the land they called home. They had everything they needed: crops that thrived in the fertile soil, animals that flourished, and most importantly, the spring. It was a sacred spring, a gift from the earth itself, its waters pure and endless. The villagers lived in harmony with the spring, knowing it provided the balance that kept them safe and prosperous. For generations, life in Selia was abundant. The villagers honored the spring, never forgetting to offer thanks, never taking more than they needed. But as time passed, the old ways were forgotten. The generations that followed grew careless. They began to see the spring not as a gift, but as a right, something to be taken without thought. They polluted the waters, tore down the sacred trees that surrounded it, and took more than they needed. Their greed spread like a shadow over the land, and slowly, the earth began to show signs of suffering. One summer, when the sun hung heavy in the sky, the water stopped flowing. At first, the villagers did not notice. The sky was clear, the mountains stood tall as ever, and life seemed normal. But soon the crops began to wither, the animals grew thirsty, and the villagers found themselves with nothing but dry earth and barren land. The spring had stopped, and the villagers didn't know why. They searched the valley, the rivers, the streams, but there was no water. The land that had once flourished now lay dry and cracked. It wasn't until Timo, a young boy, began to think about the stories his grandmother had told him that the truth began to emerge. Timo had always been close to his grandmother. On quiet evenings, she would sit by the hearth and tell him the ancient stories of the village, stories of how the spring was once a sacred gift, and how it had been sealed by the spirit that protected it after their ancestors had offended it. The villagers had forgotten the old ways, and the spirit had responded by sealing the water. The villagers had never understood why the spring stopped flowing. They had no idea that it was their own ancestors' actions that had caused the curse. Timo remembered the words of his grandmother clearly. The spirit watches over the land, but if we fail to respect it, if we forget the old ways, it will turn away from us, and the waters will stop flowing. The drought had reached its worst, and Timo could see the suffering in the eyes of the villagers. He knew he had to do something. With the memory of his grandmother's warnings burning in his mind, he approached his mother. She stood by their dry well, her face grim with worry. "Mother, I know what's happened," Timo said quietly, his voice trembling with both fear and resolve. "The spring is sealed, the spirit of the land, it's angry." His mother looked at him, confusion flickering across her face. "What are you saying, Timo? The spring's just dried up. We need to find a way to fix it." "No, Mother," Timo continued. "Grandmother always told me the stories. Our ancestors wronged the spirit. They polluted the waters and took too much. The spirit sealed the spring to punish them. And now the land is suffering because of what they did." Timo's mother hesitated, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand. "You're saying it's because of what our ancestors did?" Timo nodded. "Yes, but we can make it right. I can restore the water. I can ask the spirit for forgiveness. It's my only chance to save us all." With no time left to waste, Timo packed his belongings, a small sack of food, a water bottle, and the faded ancient map his grandmother had given him long ago. He knew the journey to the spring would be perilous. The forest that surrounded it was dense and dark, full of hidden dangers, and the spirit itself would not forgive easily. But he had no other choice. He was the only one who could undo the curse. His heart raced as he ventured into the forest the next morning. The path was narrow and winding, the air thick with a strange unease. Timo could feel eyes watching him from the shadows, though no one was there. The deeper he went, the darker and colder the forest became. The trees loomed over him like silent giants, their branches tangled like twisted fingers. Strange noises echoed in the distance, whispers in the wind, the creaking of ancient wood. It felt as though the very land was holding its breath, waiting for him to pass. By the time the sun began to set, Timo was exhausted. His legs ached, and the weight of the journey seemed unbearable. But just as his hope began to falter, he reached the clearing. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly, a deep rumble that seemed to echo from the earth itself. And then the spring appeared, hidden among the rocks, a pool of water so still it mirrored the dark sky above. It was beautiful, but there was something wrong. Something about the way the water shimmered unnaturally, as if it were waiting, not flowing. Suddenly, the mist thickened. A figure began to emerge from the water. At first, it was just a ripple, but then the figure solidified, an immense creature, its body made of swirling water and mist, its eyes glowing with an ethereal light. It was the spirit of the spring, more terrifying than any story had described. "You come," the spirit's voice boomed, its voice like the crash of waves against cliffs. "But do you understand the cost?" Timo stood frozen. The spirit's eyes bore into him, radiating a power he could hardly comprehend. The air around him grew colder, and a sharp wind swept through the clearing, lifting the water from the spring into the air in swirling vortices. "I have come to ask for forgiveness," Timo said, though his voice trembled. "The village needs the water. My people are suffering. I am here to make things right." The spirit's form twisted and shifted, its glowing eyes narrowing. "Forgiveness? You come, child of those who offended me, and think words alone can undo their mistakes?" The ground beneath Timo's feet began to crack, and he stepped back, his pulse racing. The air grew heavier, and the forest seemed to close in around him. There was no escaping now. The spirit raised its arms, and Timo could feel the temperature drop as the mist grew thicker, wrapping around him like an unseen hand. The spring's waters began to rise, swirling violently in response to the spirit's wrath. "If you wish to restore the flow of water, you must prove yourself," the spirit's voice boomed, shaking the very earth beneath Timo's feet. "Your ancestors failed me, desecrated the land and forgot the old ways. Do you truly believe you can undo their wrongs? You will face 3 trials, fail, and the village will remain barren, and I will never allow the spring to flow again." Timo's heart hammered in his chest as the air crackled with tension. He knew he had no choice but to face the trials. He couldn't let the village perish. But how could he succeed where the people before him had failed? The weight of history pressed down on him. The spirit's eyes glowed brighter, its form shifting in the mist. The first trial would begin, the spirit's voice echoed in Timo's mind. "The first trial is of courage. You must walk through the forest of shadows, where fear takes shape. Only those with true bravery will survive." Timo stepped forward, his heart pounding. The trees seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer and darker with every step. He could hear whispers in the wind, the sound of footsteps behind him. The darkness seemed to press against him, suffocating him. But Timo pressed on, focusing on the village, on the people who depended on him. His fear was real, but his resolve was stronger. He had to continue. As he ventured deeper into the forest, the shadows began to form shapes. Twisted figures that reached out with clawed hands, their faces twisted in grotesque mockery of human form. But Timo did not stop. He pushed through the fear, his courage carrying him forward. Finally, he reached the end of the forest. Sweat poured down his face, but he had passed the first trial. The second trial would be of wisdom. The spirit's voice rang out, "To pass this trial, you must solve the riddle of the river. Fail, and you will never see the spring again." Timo stood at the edge of a vast river, its waters flowing swiftly. A voice emerged from the depths, asking a riddle, one that seemed impossible to answer. Timo thought long and hard. It wasn't just about knowledge, it was about understanding the land, the balance that his ancestors had forgotten. With a sudden flash of insight, Timo spoke the answer aloud. The river parted, revealing the path to the final trial. The spirit's voice grew cold and distant. "The final trial is of the heart. You must show that you have the courage to make the ultimate sacrifice to save not only your village, but the land itself." Timo's eyes widened as the final test was revealed, a challenge that would force him to choose between his own life and the future of Selia. This version takes Timo through a suspense-filled journey of discovery, where he must face both external and internal challenges to undo the wrongs of the past. The trials test his courage, wisdom, and heart, each one more difficult than the last, creating a story filled with tension and high stakes as Timo fights to restore the spring and save his village. Timo stood before the spirit, his heart pounding, his body trembling with the weight of the final trial. The voice of the spirit echoed through the air like a thunderstorm. "You have proven yourself worthy, child of Selia," the spirit said, its form swirling around him like mist, glowing with an ethereal light. "But now you must face the greatest test of all. To restore the waters, to heal the land, you must choose. Will you sacrifice yourself to save your people, or will you turn away and spare your life?" Timo's mind raced. He had already come so far, endured the trials, and faced the spirit. He understood that his ancestors had been selfish, that they had taken too much and forgotten to honor the sacred spring. But he also understood that he had the power to break that cycle, to restore balance. He was not just fighting for his own life, he was fighting for the future of his people, the village he loved. He looked the spirit in the eyes, his voice steady despite the weight of the decision. "I will not sacrifice my life," he said with resolve, "but I will give everything else, my heart, my courage, my wisdom. I will return to the village and make sure the people understand that the spring must be honored, that the balance between us and the land must never be broken again." The spirit's eyes softened, and for the first time, a sense of warmth filled the air. The ground beneath Timo's feet trembled gently, as if the very earth was listening to his words. "You have wisdom beyond your years, young one," the spirit said, its voice now full of respect. "Your heart is pure, and your resolve strong. You do not need to give your life to restore the water. Instead, you must go back to your village and teach them what you have learned. The waters will flow again, but only if they honor the sacred balance." With a final burst of energy, the spirit extended its form towards Timo, a warm light enveloping him. The mist swirled around him like a whirlwind, but this time it did not consume him. Instead, the dry earth beneath his feet began to soften, and soon the spring was filled with fresh, clear water. The river that had once been dry surged with life, and the surrounding land began to bloom with new growth. The scent of fresh grass filled the air, and the once barren valley was now alive again. Timo watched in awe as the transformation unfolded before him. The land had been healed, the waters returned to their rightful place, and the spirit of the spring began to fade, leaving behind only a lingering glow. "You have done it, Timo," the spirit's voice whispered, like a soft breeze through the trees. "The curse is lifted. The waters will flow again, but only if your people remember the balance. Never forget the lesson you have learned today. Teach them well, and the spring will remain a gift." Timo nodded, a sense of peace washing over him. "I will. I promise." The spirit disappeared, leaving behind only the sounds of the flowing spring and the soft rustle of the trees. Timo turned toward the path that would lead him back to Selia. His heart was light, and though the journey had been perilous, he knew that his work was not done. He had to make sure that his people remembered the old ways, that they respected the land and the spring that had given them so much. When Timo returned to the village, the people gathered in awe as they saw the rivers filled with water and the fields green again. The land had been restored, the crops began to grow once more, and life returned to Selia. But Timo knew that it was not just the spirit's magic that had saved them, it was the lessons he had learned and the wisdom he had gained from his journey. Timo stood before the villagers, his face filled with both joy and determination. "The spring is restored," he said, his voice firm. "But we must never forget how we came to this point. Our ancestors offended the spirit of the land, and for that, the waters were sealed. We cannot allow the same mistakes to happen again. The spring is a gift, not a right. We must honor it, protect it, and never take more than we need. Only then will the land continue to thrive." The villagers listened in silence, their eyes wide with understanding. The elders, who had once forgotten the old ways, now nodded solemnly. They had seen the power of the spirit, and they knew Timo's words were true. "We will honor the spring," Timo's mother said, her voice filled with pride. "We will teach our children, and they will teach their children. We will remember the lessons of the past and make sure the waters never run dry again." From that day forward, the people of Selia kept their promise. They tended to the land with care, never taking more than they needed, and always offering thanks to the spirit for the gift of the spring. The village flourished, and the water flowed freely as long as the balance was maintained. And as for Timo, he grew to be a wise leader, known not only for his bravery, but for the wisdom he shared with others. He never forgot the trials he faced, the lessons he learned, and the sacrifice that had brought his people back from the brink of destruction. Every year, the villagers would gather by the spring, and Timo's story would be told, a story of courage, wisdom, and the eternal bond between the people and the land. It was a reminder that the balance must always be honored, for the gift of the spring was a treasure that could not be taken for granted. And so, Timo's legacy lived on, not in death, but in the life he helped restore, the village he saved, and the lessons that would be passed down for generations to come. This new ending brings a sense of hope, redemption, and responsibility, with Timo returning to Selia as a hero, full of wisdom and determination to ensure the village never forgets the importance of honoring the spring. His journey ends not in sacrifice, but in the promise of a brighter future for Selia, with the lessons learned from the past shaping a better tomorrow